Frank Castle is coming back, but this time it does not feel like a simple revenge story anymore. The moment Marvel revealed the Punisher One Last Kill, something about the title immediately felt different to me. Darker, heavier, almost tragic. And honestly, if you think this project is just another brutal side story disconnected from the larger MCU, I think we are looking at this completely wrong. Because right now, every clue points towards something much bigger. Daredevil, Born Again, has already pulled Frank Castle directly into Marvel's street-level world again. Spider-Man, Brand New Day is reportedly leaning heavily into grounded crime stories. Wilson Fisk is rising politically, vigilantes are becoming targets, and somewhere in the middle of all that chaos stands Frank Castle, a man who has spent his entire life believing punishment is the only language evil understands. That is why this story matters so much. It is not only about violence anymore. It feels like Marvel is finally asking the question nobody else in the MCU wants to answer. What happens when a man who only knows war becomes tired of fighting, but the world refuses to let him stop? To really understand why One Last Kill could become one of the most important street-level MCU stories ever made, we first need to understand Frank Castle himself. Frank was never a traditional superhero. He was an ex-Marine trained for combat, survival, interrogation, and pure destruction. Then his family was murdered, and that moment shattered whatever normal life still existed inside him. The Netflix series made this painfully clear. Frank did not become the Punisher because he wanted power. He became the Punisher because grief poisoned every remaining part of him. Every criminal he hunted felt less like justice and more like another desperate attempt to silence the pain in his head. And honestly, that is what always made Frank terrifying to me. Underneath all the guns, rage, and brutality, he is emotionally exhausted. He keeps moving because stopping would force him to confront how broken he really is. That is also why his relationship with Matt Murdock matters so much. Matt believes the system can still work. Frank believes the system failed the moment innocent people died while criminals survived. One man believes in justice, the other believes in punishment. That ideological clash became one of the strongest parts of Daredevil, and now Marvel is clearly bringing it back in a much larger way through Born Again. We already know Wilson Fisk is becoming more powerful than ever. He is no longer just a crime boss hiding in shadows. He is becoming a public figure with influence, political reach, and enough power to turn public opinion against vigilantes entirely. That changes everything for characters like Daredevil and Punisher. Matt Murdock still wants to protect Hell's Kitchen without becoming a killer. But Frank Castle has absolutely no trust left in institutions, politicians, or laws. Recent reports even suggest One Last Kill takes place around the same timeline as Born Again Season 2, and if that is true, then Marvel is probably building one continuous street-level narrative across multiple projects. Imagine Matt barely surviving a war across New York while Frank vanishes completely after crossing a line even he cannot justify anymore. That disappearance could directly become the opening of One Last Kill, with Frank trying to isolate himself from the world before violence drags him back in again. And honestly, that title keeps bothering me in the best possible way. Marvel rarely chooses titles without meaning something deeper. One Last Kill sounds less like a war cry and more like a confession. It almost feels like Frank Castle already knows his story is reaching the end. Maybe this is his final mission. Maybe this is the last revenge he believes he needs before finally disappearing forever. Or maybe the title is much more emotional than we expect. What if Frank is trying to stop killing entirely? That would honestly be the most tragic direction possible, because violence is the only thing he understands anymore. Reports about the story already mentioned Frank attempting some kind of peaceful life before being dragged back into conflict. That detail feels extremely important because if Marvel wanted another simple action story, they would never focus on peace. They would focus on war. I keep thinking there might be a younger character involved somehow. Maybe someone innocent trapped in Fisk's larger operations. Someone Frank slowly begins protecting instead of using as collateral damage. For the first time in years, he might actually care whether somebody survives. That changes everything. Suddenly, this story stops being about revenge and starts becoming about redemption, guilt, and whether Frank Castle still has any humanity left underneath the skull symbol. Now, this is where things become really interesting because the biggest mystery surrounding all of this is Spider-Man: Brand New Day. The moment reports started teasing Punisher connections to the movie, people immediately got confused. Why would Frank Castle appear in a Spider-Man story? But honestly, the more I think about it, the more perfect this setup becomes. After No Way Home, Peter Parker lost everything. Nobody remembers him anymore. No Avengers, no Stark support, no normal life. Peter is completely alone now, surviving as a grounded street-level Spider-Man again, and that creates the perfect environment for Frank Castle to enter his story. Think about how different these two characters are. Spider-Man saves criminals because he believes people can change. Punisher executes criminals because he believes they never will. That is classic Marvel conflict right there. And emotionally, it becomes even stronger because both characters are driven by loss. Peter lost Aunt May. Frank lost his entire family. Both carry grief every single day, but they responded to that pain in completely opposite ways. Peter chose responsibility. Frank chose punishment. If these two finally meet in the MCU, it will not just be another hero crossover. It could become one of the most emotionally intense ideological battles Marvel has ever made. I can already picture the first confrontation so clearly in my head. Imagine Spider-Man tracking a weapons shipment across rainy rooftops late at night while criminals start dropping one by one before Peter can even stop them. No jokes, no music, just panic. Then suddenly, Frank Castle steps out of the darkness holding a rifle while police sirens echo through the city below. Peter immediately tries stopping him, but Frank sees Spider-Man as part of the problem. Too soft, too emotional, too unwilling to finish what he starts. And honestly, Fisk manipulating that conflict would make complete sense. If Fisk is running a political campaign against vigilantes, using Frank as a weapon against Spider-Man could become incredibly effective. Frank might genuinely believe eliminating certain criminals permanently is the only way to save innocent people. Meanwhile, Peter keeps risking his own life trying to preserve morality inside a city that barely deserves it anymore. That rooftop fight people keep theorizing about could become unforgettable if Marvel handles it correctly. Not because of flashy action, but because both characters would technically believe they are protecting the city. That is what makes the conflict tragic. Neither of them sees himself as the villain. They simply cannot agree on where the moral line should exist anymore. But here is the part nobody talks about enough. I do not think Frank Castle's role in Brand New Day will stay antagonistic for long. Deep down, I think Marvel is setting up something much more emotional between Peter and Frank. Because when Frank looks at Peter Parker, he might see the version of himself that still had a chance to remain human. Peter is grieving, isolated, angry, and emotionally vulnerable right now. He could absolutely fall into darker methods if pushed hard enough, and that is where Frank becomes terrifyingly important. Imagine a quiet conversation after some brutal fight where Peter asks Frank if killing criminals ever made the pain disappear. Frank pauses for a second because he already knows the answer. No, it never fixed anything. It only left him emptier. I honestly believe Marvel could deliver one incredible scene where Frank warns Peter directly not to become him. Just imagine that line in John Bernthal's voice, "Do not become me." That moment alone could become the emotional heart of the entire movie, because suddenly Punisher stops being just a violent anti-hero and becomes a cautionary tale. Peter would realize that grief without hope eventually transforms people into monsters who cannot escape themselves anymore. And then everything starts connecting back to One Last Kill again. What if the entire purpose of that project is preparing Frank Castle for one final act of redemption inside Brand New Day? Think about the structure Marvel could be building here. Born Again reintroduces Frank into the evolving street-level MCU. One Last Kill explores his exhaustion, guilt, and failed attempts at peace. Then, Brand New Day delivers the emotional payoff where Frank finally chooses to save someone instead of punishing someone. Honestly, that would complete his entire arc beautifully. I keep imagining a climax where Spider-Man is trapped in an impossible situation against Fisk's forces or some larger criminal network, and Frank realizes Peter still represents something worth protecting. Maybe Frank sacrifices himself so Peter can escape. Maybe he publicly takes the blame for something to protect Spider-Man's identity. Or maybe he simply disappears forever after saving Peter, finally understanding that preserving innocence matters more than feeding endless violence. Whatever direction Marvel chooses, the emotional weight could be massive if they commit fully to it, because Frank Castle dying violently would not actually feel meaningful anymore. But Frank Castle choosing compassion over punishment for the first time in years, that would completely redefine the character in the MCU. Another reason I think this theory holds weight is because Marvel clearly seems serious about expanding the street-level side of the universe again. Recent reports continue hinting toward Defenders-related projects, more grounded crime stories, and larger anti-vigilante tensions spreading across New York. And honestly, this is exactly the direction the MCU desperately needs right now. Cosmic stories are exciting, but street-level stories feel personal. When Spider-Man swings through damaged neighborhoods while Fisk controls politicians and Punisher hunts criminals in abandoned buildings, the stakes suddenly become human again. You can actually feel fear, desperation, and moral conflict. I would not be surprised at all if One Last Kill quietly sets up future appearances from characters like Jessica Jones or Luke Cage. Even small references could establish that New York's vigilantes are slowly being forced together because Fisk's influence is becoming impossible to fight individually. And imagine how powerful a future Spider-Man and Daredevil partnership could become after both characters encounter Frank Castle. Matt Murdock sees the danger of losing morality. Peter sees the danger of losing hope. Frank becomes the warning standing between them. That dynamic alone could become the foundation for Marvel's next era of grounded storytelling if they handle it with patience instead of rushing toward giant crossover events immediately. What makes Frank Castle fascinating compared to most Marvel characters is that he forces uncomfortable conversations that heroes usually avoid. Steve Rogers believed institutions could improve. Tony Stark believed technology could protect humanity. Peter Parker believes responsibility matters. But Frank asks something much darker. What happens when the system completely fails? What happens when criminals manipulate laws, buy power, and continue destroying innocent lives while ordinary people suffer? Frank's answer has always been horrifyingly simple. Punishment. Permanent punishment. That is why audiences connect with him even when they disagree with him morally. He represents pure frustration toward a broken world. And honestly, Born Again seems perfectly designed to explore that frustration through Fisk's political rise. If New York starts criminalizing vigilantes while corruption spreads everywhere, then Frank's worldview suddenly becomes dangerously persuasive. That creates incredible tension for characters like Daredevil and Spider-Man because they still desperately want to believe mercy matters. Frank does not. At least not yet. That is why One Last Kill feels so important. It might finally challenge Frank's own ideology from inside his perspective instead of simply showing him killing criminals again. If he cannot save his own soul, then his story remains a tragedy. But if he finally learns that punishment alone changes nothing, then Marvel could deliver something genuinely unforgettable. And honestly, that final possibility keeps staying in my head after connecting all these clues together. What if the title does not refer to Frank killing someone else? What if One Last Kill actually refers to Frank Castle killing the Punisher identity itself? Think about how powerful that would be. The skull symbol has controlled his life for years. Violence became his language, his purpose, and his prison. But maybe this story ends with Frank finally understanding that continuing the cycle only creates more suffering. Maybe his final battle is not against Fisk or criminals at all. Maybe it is against the part of himself that stopped believing healing was possible. That would explain why the project feels emotionally heavier than previous Punisher stories already. It sounds less like escalation and more like closure. And if Brand New Day continues that emotional thread through Peter Parker, then Marvel could create one incredible thematic connection between both characters. Peter chooses hope before rage consumes him completely. Frank chooses sacrifice before violence destroys whatever humanity remains inside him. Suddenly, these stories stop feeling separate and become one larger exploration of grief and responsibility inside the MCU's darkest corners. That is exactly why I think One Last Kill might secretly become the most important street-level Marvel project we have seen in years. Punisher was never just a violent anti-hero to me. Frank Castle is the character who forces every hero around him to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, morality, and failure. He asks the question nobody wants to answer. If the system collapses completely, what are people supposed to become in order to survive? Maybe that is why One Last Kill feels so important already. It is not simply setting up another action story. It feels like Marvel is preparing a final emotional reckoning for one of its darkest characters. And honestly, if these connections to Daredevil and Spider-Man really happen, then Frank Castle's story could end up changing the entire future of the MCU's street-level world. So tell me what you think. Does Punisher survive all this, or does his story finally end protecting Spider-Man from becoming the next version of him? Like, share, subscribe, and send your own theories in the comments. I am Liam Harrison from MovieCast, and thank you for staying with me until the very end. Absolutely.